Good evening, everybody. I am Chris Santiago, and I'm an associate professor of English here at the University of St. Thomas. We've been trying to get Kazim Ali to come read at the University of St. Thomas for many years, and so I'm really thrilled to have the chance to introduce him here and have you hear from him. But really quickly, and I think this is especially appropriate given the subject matter of the book, Northern Lights, which many of you were reading, to read the University of St. Thomas's land acknowledgement. The University of St. Thomas occupies the ancestral and current homelands of the Dakota people, Minnesota Makochi. We also recognize the Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk, whose lands were colonized by the United States and are currently occupied by the state of Minnesota. We condemn the tools of settler colonialism, including genocide and forced assimilation, undertaken in the name of white supremacy that created structures of injustice and inequity that continue to oppress and marginalize indigenous and underrepresented peoples. We work towards the process of decolonizing minds and educating students to be morally responsible leaders. We commit to the work of truth-telling and relationship building as we seek new pathways forward as relatives in the University of St. Thomas community, the indigenous communities, and those who traverse multiple communities. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Kazim Ali. Kazim Ali was born in the United Kingdom and has lived transnationally in the United States, Canada, India, France, and the Middle East. His books encompass multiple genres, including the volumes of poetry Inquisition, Skyward, winner of the Ohioana Book Award in Poetry, The Far Mosque, winner of Alice James Book's New England, New York Award, The 40th Day, All One's Blue, and the cross-genre texts Bright Felon and Wind Instrument. I was also pleased to hear today that Kazim's new and selected poems will be published next fall from Wesleyan Press. His novels include the recently published The Secret Room, a string quartet, and among his books of essays are the hybrid memoir Silver Road, Essays, Maps, and Calligraphies, and Fasting for Ramadan, Notes from a Spiritual Practice. He's also an accomplished translator of Marguerite Duras, Sohrab Saperi, Anand Devi, Mahmoud Chakralahi, and others, and an editor of several anthologies and books of criticism. After a career in public policy and organizing, Ali taught at various colleges and universities, including Oberlin College, my alma mater, Davidson College, St. Mary's College of California, and Naropa University. He's currently a professor of literature at the University of California, San Diego, and his newest books are a volume of 3 long poems entitled The Voices of Sheila Chandra and a memoir of his Canadian childhood, Northern Light. Please help me in welcoming Kazim Ali.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you. It's very cold in the northern lands of Minnesota. I am a Martell living in a stark, stark world right now. But I've survived because I've gotten company and I've gotten cheer and I've gotten loaned jackets, 2 jackets. I've gotten breakfast, lunch, dinner, although I canceled lunch. Liz and I were supposed to have lunch today, but I said I want to go get a tattoo instead, so we did that. I'm sorry I can't show it to you, but it's really cool. You'll see it. If you follow me on social media, I'll show it to you eventually. I want to open the reading with a poem that is new, that's not in any book. But it's just, I guess, like a little bit of an invocation. And it could kind of lead us into Northern Light because it's a poem called Golden Boy. And the Golden Boy is the name for the little statue that is on top of the big dome that caps the Parliament building in Manitoba, in the province of Manitoba, Canada, where Northern Light takes place. So here is a poem called Golden Boy, and I guess one might think of this poem as an ars poetica for me, for my work, for what I do. Golden Boy. Almost afraid I am in the annals of history to speak, and by speaking be seen by man or God. Such then debt in light be paid. Atop the Manitoban Parliament building in Winnipeg, what shines such a beacon to dollars, food, or God? I hallow starvation, this nation a notion beneath the body, hollowing its stomach to emptiness, and in breath the river empties. Who so spoke the craft borne along long echo and echelon, grains of light and space we with one and other wait, the soul, not the spirit. Breathe through, spirited, went or went, why true we've woven a dozen attempts. These tents, pitched on the depth be made, biped by pen may perch atop the temple pool, proven now, proven these riches of wheat and cherries and prunes, what washes over woven ocean, frayed I am, most sir desired, sired in wind, seared and warned, once in wild Umiak sworn. We parley to mend, be conned, be bent, come now called to document your meant intent, your indented mind. Hollow star, your weight in eons, there in prayer, money, morrow, more you owe, and over time God spends the spent river melt into summer. Sound out the window, sound out the spender. Where does the river road end, and in what language can prayer or commerce be offered? Ender of senses, pensive atop plural spires, be spoken or mended, broken and meant for splendor, my mentor. That guy got up and left to answer a phone call just now. Was I the only person who saw that? Yeah, probably. I'm up here, so you can't see it. It must have been a very important call. When he comes back, I think I'll ask him what it was. No, I will not. I will not. Just do not ask. It must have been important. All right. So listen. There's this book that I wrote. It's called Northern Light, Power, Land, and the Memory of Water. And I did not think that I was going to write it. I am, after all, a poet, a musician, a singer sometimes, a singer in words, a musician in words. But I discovered, as you have discovered if you read the book, if you did your reading, you may not have done, but if you did not, I will fill you in, that the town that I grew up on, I grew up in this strange little town in the 70s in northern Manitoba. It was a town of 5 streets and 1 street crossing them. And a strange little existence, a town in the middle of the forest, and we couldn't actually go into the forest because you know who lived there? Moose and wolverines and various creatures of the night. And it was like, you see that M. Night Shyamalan movie, The Village, where you can't go into the woods? It was like that. And it wasn't until many years later that I discovered that I knew my dad was building a dam, but I didn't know what happened into the community when the dam was built. And that's what this book is the story of. So I'm going to read a little bit of this to you. Here we are. Let's backtrack here. As the years went by, and one by one, my parents, brothers, and sisters and their families moved from Manitoba to the Greater Toronto area, the forests of the north receded from my memory. From time to time, I mused again on childhood days, but mostly those first winters of Genpeg were replaced in my imagination and daily life by the equally snow-filled winters of Western New York, where I mainly grew up after we left New York City, and later the winters of Ohio, where I lived for many years. And it was in the middle of one such winter in a drafty old Midwestern house in Oberlin, with a polar vortex howling down through Canada to reach its icy grip around the southern shore of Lake Erie, that I began thinking again of that town I grew up in. Was the site still there? Was the dam still operational? I had no idea. I typed the word GenPeg into a search engine, but barely any results returned. The first few stories were just dry technical accounts of the generating station, which was indeed still in operation, and there was no information at all about a town called GenPeg. But further down the feed, I happened upon an article from several years earlier entitled "Manitoba Hydro Evicted from Northern Dam Station." Evicted? I didn't understand. Didn't Manitoba Hydro own the land that the dam was being built on? Who was evicting them? I clicked on the news story to read further. The people from Cross Lake, that is the town that is near there, who called themselves the Pimichikamak, but whom the Canadian government designates as the Cross Lake Band, under the leadership of their chief, Kathy Merrick, had served Manitoba Hydro with eviction papers. 600 people had traveled the 20 kilometers from Cross Lake on foot to take custody of the generating station and adjoining housing complex, chaining shut the doors. Chief Kathy Merrick wrote of the 2014 occupation in a letter to the Winnipeg Free Press. And so here I put Kathy Merrick's letter into the book. Manitoba Hydro has been a great benefit to the province as a whole. Hydro employs 6,500 people, provides inexpensive power, and has brought $5.2 billion into the province from exports of clean energy, and she puts the word clean in quotes, in the past decade. But for us, hydro is a bitter word, and clean hydro is an insult. Our homeland has been ruined. The promises of fair treatment have been ignored. And to add insult to injury, literally, our hydro bills are much higher than the provincial average. Imagine if this is still Kathy Merrick's letter, imagine if the once pristine waters in the lake by your cottage became murky and the shoreline continually washed away. Imagine your favorite childhood camping sites eroded right off the map, your industries undercut, your favorite golf course denuded, your ancestors' graves dug up, and your place of worship defiled. Imagine if you had to constantly fight for compensation and mitigation while paying monthly bills to the victimizer. Despite all the damage we suffer, our community collectively pays Hydro about $3.6 million annually in hydro bills. Every bill is a reminder of the indignity done to us, and then, after contributing to our poverty, Hydro disconnects our people when they can't pay. As I came to learn, since unrecorded time, that land and the people on it had been called Pimichikamak, meaning roughly where a lake lies across the river, a fairly accurate description of the hydrogeography of Cross Lake. The Nelson River flows into the eponymous lake and then continues out of the lake on the other side on its journey north to Hudson Bay. Pimichikamak land spanned the northern region above Lake Winnipeg and Lake Winnipegosis, stretching across what are now the Canadian provincial borders of Saskatchewan to the west and Ontario to the east. The people of the region first encountered Europeans in the form of English traders who had been offered rights to trade in the region of Hudson Bay by the English crown and by the French traders who rushed in to compete with them when New France collapsed. A register book of an English trading post dating to 1770 lists the Pimichikamak among the various indigenous communities who came to trade, and archaeological evidence reveals the presence of Cree communities in that region of northern Manitoba for many more thousands of years. So I'm going to skip ahead now to the juicy part here. I give a little bit of history. As the polar vortex receded from Ohio, Genpeg and Cross Lake remained on my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the landscapes of my childhood. I would wake up in the night thinking of the deep, cold lake that had gathered near the shores of Genpeg as the river swelled at the dam point. What was happening there now? I wanted to know. Sitting at my computer in the twilight hours before the cold winter sun dawned, rather than search for Genpeg, I typed Cross Lake, and dozens of stories unrolled. I slumped back in my chair, reading a story I could never have imagined. Just a year before, in the winter, 6 young people in Cross Lake, between the ages of 15 and 18, had died by suicide in the space of 2 months. And in the weeks that followed, there were at least 140 more cases of attempted suicide by people in the community under the age of 25. And hundreds more young people were placed on a suicide watch list. I read further, but the more I read, the less sense it made. 140 suicide attempts in a community of 6,000 people with no resident mental health counselor. The Pimicikamak government had declared a mental health emergency and were requesting aid from the provincial and federal governments. The elders in the community had gathered and performed a sacred ceremony calling on the spirits of the land and the water to assist them. Tanya Talaga, who's an investigative reporter in Canada, Tanya Talaga draws a direct connection between the residential school system and the current crisis in Indigenous communities around substance abuse, mental health, and wellness. For the period she studied, Talaga recounts that there were 126 suicides per 100,000 men, Indigenous men, compared to 24 suicides per 100,000 non-Indigenous men. These are statistics for the Canadian communities at the time she studied. And the numbers for women were as grave. First Nations women died by suicide at a rate of 35 women per 100,000, whereas the number of non-Indigenous women dying by suicide in the same period was 5 by 100,000 people, so 7 times more dangerous. And for the Inuit communities and subarctic and Arctic regions of Canada, the numbers were shockingly higher. Inuit young people aged 15 to 24 in the period Talaga studied died by suicide at 10 times the national average. The data she imagined from other colonized populations around the world, including the Sami in Finland and indigenous populations in Brazil, were comparable. From the Pacific Islands to Palestine, to this day, one can see that the socio-political economic impacts of colonialism, such as land dispossession, cultural assimilation, disruption of traditional economies, and political disenfranchisement, are accompanied by crises in the mental and spiritual well-being of the colonized communities. We're going to skip ahead a little bit here. My mind was racing. I had to know more about what was happening in Cross Lake. So I wrote to the only email address that I could find on the internet, Chief Kathy Merricks. I told her that I was a writer. I didn't tell her I was a poet. I wanted her to just take me seriously. I told her that I was a writer and that I'd grown up in Genpeg. I told her my father worked for Manitoba Hydro, and then I asked her a few basic questions about the situation in Cross Lake. I asked her if she could point me in the direction of any news articles or research materials that might help me learn more. Several days passed before I received a brief email in response saying, "It is wonderful that you would reflect on your childhood. You are more than welcome to visit our nation." I stared at the screen. No answers to my question, but an invitation to come and visit. There, go back north after all these years. I wouldn't even know how to get there. All I remembered from my childhood were the grueling car trips that we used to take, the hours on the dirt roads and the provincial highways. There was some irony in my surprise at learning about what had happened and about my sudden hesitation at making the trip. I was no stranger to challenging travel. I'd spent years traveling to the Palestinian territory in the West Bank, teaching yoga and training yoga teachers in Ramallah, and I'd seen the impacts of occupation and political disenfranchisement up close. I'd seen the impact that the checkpoints had on free passage and on the economic and social conditions of the Palestinians. And working with actual physical bodies in the yoga practice even taught me the kinds of mental and physical trauma that individual people can manifest when the culture and a history of the people are threatened. But go back north, when the one place I really wanted to go, the town of Genpeg, apparently didn't exist anymore. And yet the possibility of seeing Cross Lake haunted me. What had happened there was somehow a part of me too. What is it that made it possible for me to recognize the damage that colonialism far from home had wrought when I thought so little about the damage that I myself might have played a role in? And why was Genpeg suddenly on my mind? How is it that all these years had passed and I had never once thought of Cross Lake, but suddenly here I was, emailing with the community's chief? In the days that followed, my course became more and more clear to me, more and more real, more and more inevitable. I explored travel options. I bought plane tickets. I was going back. I was returning to the north. So, I don't think I actually believed I was going to do it. I mean, I bought the plane tickets, I made reservations, I was setting up meetings. I found myself at a poetry festival in Salem, Massachusetts. And it was right before I was not going to fly home from Salem. I was going to get on a plane and I was going to go straight to Winnipeg. And so the night before, I had like a little bit of a freak out, sort of. It was sort of like, why am I going? You know, what are these people going to think about me? You know, like my dad is the one who did this shit, you know? So it's just like complicated, you know? So I have a friend who's an Indigenous writer, Layli Long Soldier, whose work maybe you have encountered. If you haven't, you must. And we always had lots of conversations around you know, land stuff, and I was, you know, learning a lot from her own work, her beautiful book, Whereas, and she's the one who actually originally encouraged me to think about going back as well. And so it was the night before I was in a hotel, I don't know what, like Howard Johnson or something, like watching, you know, trashy television, not the Kardashians, something else, I don't remember what it was. Help, I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, or something like that. That was the year Sanjaya was on there. And I called Layli. I thought I got to call somebody and talk to them. So I called her up on the phone to figure this out. That night at the hotel, I called my friend Layli Long Soldier, and I told her about my upcoming trip to Cross Lake. Layli is like me, something of a wanderer, having been raised in the Southwest, living in the Phoenix Valley as a child, in the Four Corners area as a teen, and then on the Navajo Nation, and later in Santa Fe, where she lives now. She also has family on the Lakota Reservation, whom she often visits. Layli's book of poetry, Whereas, has played a huge role in how I understand the actively moving parts of Indigenous language and existence on the North American continent. Her work tries to excavate sediments of hidden history, language, and politics, and I felt a sense of kinship with her as I wondered to myself, what would I discover in Cross Lake? I felt like I needed to talk to her. Kazim, she exclaimed when I explained to her what was going on, that I was leaving for Manitoba the next morning. I never knew this about your childhood, that you grew up on the res. I laughed. I never knew either. No one told us we were on treaty land. I didn't know anything about Cross Lake except that's where the other kind of Indians lived. That's always the secret, said Layli. Whose land you're on. What happened there before. In fact, I said, when we were little, we didn't even really think about the people from Cross Lake. I kind of vaguely remember people saying things about them, not really kind stuff, you know, stereotypical stuff. Layli was silent. Am I betraying my father by going? I asked her bluntly, even though honestly, I'm sure he had no idea about what might happen because of the environmental impact of the dam. I mean, how was he supposed to know? And who knew that the province was going to screw up all the treaty promises? I think you're honoring him by going, Layli said then. You're going to represent him and help remediate in some small way. Do you think, I asked, but I don't know, what can I really do? Write about it? How's that gonna matter? Who's gonna read what a poet has to say? Well, she said matter-of-factly, you can't avoid it anymore. You opened the door. Why are you really nervous? Do you think people there are mad at me or my father? I asked. She pauses. They wouldn't ask you to sweat if that were the case. They invited me to be in the sweat lodge with them the first night that I went. It was actually interesting when I called to make the appointments, the counselor said, it's fine, we're, welcome, we're happy to have you. And the first night you're here, we're gonna set up a sweat lodge ceremony. And you'll go through that first, and then we'll talk to you afterwards. And it kind of made me like a little nervous because I thought like, oh, is this like a cleansing, purifying kind of thing? Because I grew up in a very extremely conservative religious environment, and I sort of had a little bit of a reaction against that part of religion that says like, you're an unclean person, but we're gonna do this to you, and now you are a clean person, you're acceptable. Like I kind of resisted that. And so when they told me that they wanted me to go through the sweat lodge, I felt a little nervous about that and a little resistant to the idea, but I knew I was gonna have to do it. Like the practicality is I knew I was gonna have to do it, but I wasn't happy about it. So the sweat lodge, back to here. So she says, they wouldn't ask you to sweat if that were the case. Maybe, I replied, but I'm wondering what they're expecting of me. I mean, I'm gonna go up there and I have to go through the sweat lodge. Like, are they trying to purify me or something? That's not how it works, said Layli. Our spirituality is not transactional. It's an invitation to you to share in their life. They're welcoming you as family. They're inviting you into their community and their sacred space. There are no strings attached to that from their side because they believe in the powers of the ceremony itself. But don't go in if you aren't willing to be changed. And that's the thing. I wasn't sure if I was willing to be changed. If anything, I felt apprehensive. My father is one of the men who built this dam that led to so many broken promises, to such economic, social, and environmental disaster. How was I supposed to account for that? People have been connected to the land for thousands and thousands of years, Layli continued. To be cut off from it is not a small thing, but honestly, Kazim, when you think about how few years it has really been since the Europeans came to this continent and changed things so much, we're only at the chronological beginning of the trauma. There's still time to work against the disconnect, to reconcile with both land and people. I think that's why they invited you. Inviting you to the sweat lodge was a gesture of generosity. They're asking for your service, not just to report on them or to be a passive witness. But that's the part I wonder about. What can I do in the end? Well, said Layli, changing the subject, what started you on all this in the first place? You were looking for information on your hometown, and you found out about the dam's impact, but then why did you get so fixated? It was the rash of suicides, I replied. I couldn't believe it when I read it. It happened last year, 7 suicides in 1 month, and then 25 more attempted suicides at a school with 500 students? Can you imagine? The council called a state of emergency. The elders performed some ceremony. Layli cut me off. Wait, what? In the spring, I said impatiently, last March, the elders, they declared a state of emergency and performed this ceremony calling on the spirits of the land and the water and the sky to come and help the young people in the community. Oh, Kazim, she said, her voice dropping, and I couldn't tell if she was kidding or not. They called you. So that is the end of my reading from Northern Light. It's not the end of the story from Northern Light. There's a lot more. That's just the beginning of the book. But I will read you a couple poems to close the reading out, and then I think we're going to do some questions and answers, if you have questions for me. So some of you who've read Northern Light know that it starts the same way that a poem of mine starts. This is the first sentence in the book Northern Light. I have always had a hard time answering the question, where are you from? Some of you may have that same problem. And this is a poem that begins with that same line, which is on page, I don't know what page it's on, 23 of this book. I should check the time, shouldn't I? Okay. This is a poem called Origin Story. Actually, you know, I read this poem to the class, didn't I? So I should read a different one, right? What do you want me to read? No? You don't have a thought? I'm sure you have a thought. Origin story? Okay. Someone always asks me, where are you from? And I want to say, a body is a body of matter flung from all corners of the universe, and I am a patriot of breath, of sin, of the endless clamor out the window. But what I say is, I am from nowhere, which is also a convenience, a kind of lie. When I was sitting in the Bombay airport this January on a 40-hour layover, rushing home because my mother had had a stroke and was not yet verbal, I wondered about my words. Perhaps I am from my words, because the basic biography is ordinary. Born in Croydon to a mother and a father who on different sides of a national border were married in wartime and had to reunite in England to the only place they could both get to. Born at home, 76 Bingham Street, midwived and not doctored into the world. Taken back to India when the war was over, where I came into language, and of the 7 that were spoken in the house, I began speaking 4 as the same. Then to the cold Canadian north we went, to a town that no longer exists, on the other side of Cross Lake, from the Indians who lost everything because of the dam my father was helping to build. Then to Winnipeg, then to New York, then to Buffalo, which I can claim. I can say I am from Buffalo because it is a city of poets, the city of Lucille Clifton. I arrived there in cold January to find my mother a little slowed down, but still self-possessed enough to cook meals for everybody, even if she didn't remember the names for all the spices she was using. She talks by the time I arrive, but slowly and deliberately, and she has to listen very carefully to be able to respond. She pauses while she talks and cocks her head while she thinks. She does not criticize me nor say anything about my wild hair, and our ordinary silence does not seem as suffocating because I wait patiently while she strains to find each word. And what on earth does it mean that I almost like my mother better this way? When she goes to her doctor's appointment, I get out my copy of Lucille Clifton's book, Good Woman, and comb through its lines to find the addresses where she grew up and lived. I climb into the car with a map and a journal, and I drive through the snow to find those places and take photographs of the empty lots where the houses once stood. Listen, I have no answer to your question. I am not kidding when I tell you I earned my own voice. The shape it makes in the world holds me. I have no hometown, no mother tongue. I have not been a good son. Thank you. And I'm going to close the reading with this last poem. I want to change it up a little bit. I want to just do, it's not all dire and dour and dire. This is a poem called Marie's Crisis. And I wrote it because, in June of 2016, there was a terrible shooting at a gay bar in Orlando in which many people lost their lives, primarily Latinx people. And I was asked by a poet, Natalie Diaz, she was compiling responses, poems about that incident. And she asked me to write a poem about it, and I said I couldn't, so I didn't participate in that project. But I started to think about the places that are safe places for gay and lesbian people, including the bars. And so this is a poem called Marie's Crisis. Marie's Crisis is a piano bar in the West Village. And a lot of times, the singers and dancers from the Broadway shows, when they're finished with their shows, they go down to Marie's Crisis and they sing. So you hear this like high quality of music for free. You just sit there and listen. So Marie's Crisis, and I want to say that the speaker in this poem is an imaginary, fictional. It's not meant to be. You're not meant to think this is me. It's a persona, I guess you would say. And the speaker is meant to be drunk. So it's like I had to act as if I was drunk in the poem itself. And if you're from the 80s, you know who Helen Terry is and you know who Culture Club is. If you're not, Google is your friend. Marie's Crisis. We stumble through the strafing night to any harbor we think safe, and we find one on some corner in the West Village called Marie's Crisis, and in it scores of men huddle around a grand piano and sing songs together. At some point, a woman who looks like Helen Terry, the big backup singer from Culture Club, emerges from the kitchen to sing a number for the boys. The crowd falls silent, and she starts belting it out, and immediately I want to know, wait, what is the crisis? And immediately after, why is a song called a number? I know Pythagoras believed that music resonated between planets and that the notes of the scale could be calculated and that each note itself was not even singular but had a dominant tone with 3 other harmonic tones underneath it. It's all true. Or am I making all this up? And why do you care? And why haven't you taken your pants off yet? Marie is singing Janis Joplin, and I imagine that I can actually feel the porosity of the table under my fingers. There's a cute, skinny blonde at the bar, and he's wearing a short-sleeved plaid shirt, which I think I can get on board with, but ironed jeans with boat shoes, not so much. I'm trying to figure out exactly what to say to him, but my field is physics, not chemistry. I open with, I wrote my dissertation on the agitation that occurs in world sheets during a redshift event. Not my strongest effort. He responds with, in Indian dance, the face is actually an instrument of the body, and so its expressions are part of the choreography. Marie looks like she's about to burst out laughing. I know the look. It's called the show tune face. Look ridiculously happy while belting out whatever song is at hand at the top of your lungs, even if it's a sad one. No one cares. She's singing Sinatra. I met this kid in Brooklyn once who said he was Frank's son. He grew up with his mom in suburban Jersey, and Frank never acknowledged him as his son, but he did used to come around and have dinner with them every once in a while and leave an envelope full of cash. It was the night my friend Ava is Ada Limon, by the way, if you must know. There, you know a secret. I'm getting you some gossip. It was the night my friend Ava taught me how to take tequila shots, and I had had 7, and ended the night chatting up Danny in between his stints dancing on the bar. I found I didn't really have anything to say to him except that I believed him, that I thought Frank really was his father, that he looked just like him. And as soon as I'd said it, "These boots are made for walking" came on the radio, and I thought it was pretty likely that it was a sign, but I didn't say anything. And I don't know what Danny was thinking because he didn't say anything either. And Marie started singing a bluesy, folksy version of I Saw the Sign, and it made me remember my friend Iraqi, who used to be my lover, and then only my friend, but maybe isn't even that anymore because I haven't heard from him in 8 months, and I have no idea what he's doing because all he ever posts on Facebook are links to news stories about public health. Marie's voice is scratchy and smoky and whiskey-soaked, and it's not even what you'd call good or pretty, but she is singing for everything she's worth. And the bar is cute, but small and a little shabby. And the blonde wants to know if I'll sing a duet with him when Marie is done. And that makes me think either I better marry him or make a run for it while I've still got some lead time. I can't sing, but I have developed an equation that can calculate exactly how long it is going to take for you to take off your pants. Don't say physics doesn't have any practical applications. Then someone tells me, that's not even Marie. It's Maggie, the night manager. It's been a week since that club in Florida got shot up, and my parents still haven't called to see how I'm doing. Maggie's singing the Boy George part of Church of the Poison Mind, and I'm 3 sheets to the wind anyhow. So I tell you what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna climb up on top of that piano and do the Helen Terry part. Maggie's voice is straining, and this is not even her crisis. But she's the biggest star in the room, and a girl needs backup. All right, thank you. Thank you, thank you. So that was my poem about the Pulse nightclub shooting, although it was only mentioned in that one particular line, but you know, that's how we do it. So hey, I think we gotta have some time to have a little conversation and or answer questions, and I'm happy to tell you anything I know. I already gave you some hot goss in the last, during the last poem, so that's something. Who's going first? Oh, there's a question over here. Yeah, go ahead. Do you want him to do the mic? Yeah, I guess they want you to do the mic.
And then we got one back.
Oh, and there's one in the back too. Great. Questions, lots of questions. Love it.
My question is, like, when you're writing your poems, obviously, and like your book, it's each on their own are very different. What is your process for each, like, when it comes to like writing a book or versus a poem?
Oh yeah. Well, they're not really written together as a book necessarily. They just come individually, and then a long time after, when there's a lot of them, they might fly together. But for each one, it always does start kind of with a phrase or a thought, and for me, anyways, always by hand, pen and paper, and always out loud too. Like I start reciting it almost as soon as while I'm writing it. And then occasionally there are assignments that help me to shape it. So with Marie's Crisis, I was just writing it more generally, but as I started to kind of revise or shape it, I guess you would say, I started to arrange it in lines that felt like they were longer lines, and the stanzas were started to be like, seem like they could be 6 lines. So I did 1 or 2 that were in 6-line stanzas, and then I realized, okay, that's the way that I'm gonna organize this. So the whole poem is in 6-line stanzas. So sometimes a trick like that, it will just kind of reveal itself in a way. Occasionally you might write in a form that calls for that and you're specifically aiming for that, but in my case I just kind of try to pay attention to what the architecture, like what it might seem like, whether the lines are short or long. Golden Boy, which is the poem I read at the very beginning, is in 3-line stanzas. But it wasn't in the earliest versions. So sometimes you kind of discover it while you're working on it. And it really is true that it comes as you read it out loud, then it changes. As far as the poems being very different from each other, once there's a whole bunch and you start to think about it as a book, then I really consciously try to mix it up and have different types of poems. So instead of having 10 poems in a row that all look the same or are about the same thing, they kind of mix them up a little bit. And very occasionally, I'll have 2 poems that I like them and they're separate, but they sort of do the same thing, and so then I might only put 1 in the book. If you read Inquisition carefully, if you read it a lot, you might, maybe one person in this room might have noticed that the last 2 poems in the book, they're different poems, but they kind of are about the same thing, and they kind of end the same way-ish, and it's because it originally was the second to last poem was the last poem in the book, and then I wrote the last poem and I loved it so much and I really wanted to put them both in, and even though it was against my better judgment, I put them both in. And so they kind of, it's a little repetitive actually, but you know, whatever. Probably nobody but me notices. Now 500 more people know, so.
Hi, you kind of touched on the intergenerational trauma caused by colonialism, specifically in Cross Lake. And you also touched on the increased suicide rates amongst Indigenous people in that area. I guess, how did you find that those 2 things were connected? And how direct would you say that causal relationship kind of is?
Yes, the mental health crisis the mental health issues, the substance abuse, and the suicide epidemics. And Cross Lake is not the only Indigenous community in which there were suicide epidemics. There was one in Thunder Bay as well, and other places too, including very recently. So it's a real problem, and there isn't the infrastructure to handle it as well. If you think about a community of 6,000 people, there was one mental health professional in the entire community, and he was a marriage counselor. So he was not prepared for this, but he was called in to do all this, suicide watch, suicide prevention type of work that he, I'm sure you can imagine what that was like, So it is something the Canadian government and the Ministry of Health, et cetera, have to pay more attention to. There's a book that I can recommend to you. It's called All Our Relations. And that is the book by Tanya Talaga that talks about this very issue. And Talaga is spelled Talaga. So if this is interesting to you, I recommend that book. There's a bibliography at the end of Northern Light, including suggestions for further reading, and it's on there. And she also wrote a beautiful book of investigative reporting on the suicide epidemic in Thunder Bay that was called Seven Fallen Feathers, which I also recommend. But All Our Relations is more directly about the connection that she draws between the residential school system in Canada, which is I do talk a lot about in the book, but I did not read anything about that today, but is in there. And she discusses the legacy of the residential school system, which in Canada only ended in the 90s. It went on for a much longer time there than it did here in the States. Yeah. Thank you for your question. There's one over here in the front, and maybe another one. And one over there too, yeah. There's a microphone coming around. Hello.
How would you say that your traveling and your sort of intercultural experiences throughout the world have influenced your writing and your poetry specifically?
Well, I definitely feel like a poet of place, so to speak. Like wherever I am, it really impacts me and I have a real response to it. I lived for a bunch of years along the Hudson River, and so that river kind of obsessed me, and it appeared in all of my poems. And then I lived near the Great Lakes. Now I live by an ocean, so I do feel governed by my surroundings. And when I travel to new places and new cities, I always want to go. One of the things I often do that infuriates the people I travel with, which is we'll arrive in a new city and I'll just want to walk through the city and kind of just learn the place by foot, basically. And I get really interested in the music, the art that's there, all of that kind of thing, like the vibe. I don't, like I said, when I was reading this to you, I don't often do this kind of research-based nonfiction. This was a new thing for me. I'm usually a lot more self-centered. So I'd go to Portugal and listen to fado music and say, oh, I want to write a poem about fado music, or something like that, like just oriented around me. But in this case, it was completely outwardly focused towards the community. It was a completely different project. Has the cold northern winter and the stars, the cloudless stars, has they come into my poetry? Not since I was there. Before I went, I did. They were in my imagination. But when I went there, and as encountering the legacy of the dam, and talking to the people and writing about it, I found myself unable to romanticize it in that way anymore. So I don't write about those things in like metaphorical ways, because I've written the ugly truth. So do you know what I mean? It kind of took that part away a little bit. Yeah. Thanks.
All right, so I really loved your book, but when reading it, I noticed something that's super unique compared to like every other book that I've read. In your book, or we picked it up as a class as well after mentioning it, but it looked like it was kind of unknown knowledge. Your book is written in the present tense tone instead of like a past tense tone. I checked a bunch of my other books to make sure I wasn't crazy, and like my other books were written in present tense as well, and they weren't. Maybe hearing it from your voice might be better in clarifying why. I would love to know.
Well, okay, the last part, hearing it in my voice, will not necessarily clarify. I mean, there should be a reason when you read the book and then kind of think, well, what does this make me feel like, that should be good enough, actually, But I will say this much, because I don't want to tease you, but it was so that we could be in the present tense of my own discovery, because I go there as a complicit narrator, but as a narrator, I don't know things. I have to discover things as I go along. And so you had to be kind of careful, because we also needed to provide background. So I had to be able to say something about the residential schools and the pass system and the treaties and the royal proclamation, because especially the US American audiences wouldn't know anything about the kind of that esoterica of Canadian history. So we needed to get it in there, but there would be stuff like in a novel, stuff that the reader knows and stuff that the characters know. And if there's a first-person narrator, there might even be, things that the reader knows that the narrator themselves doesn't know or doesn't realize. And so we were playing a careful game, and we tried to show me learning things. When Jackson is explaining to me, or when Kathy Merrick is explaining things to me, that for me to feel like, wow, I didn't know this, and then to learn it in the process of the book. And so that's why the book is in present tense, because when we can put things in past tense, it can be like, okay, this is background stuff. Or very occasionally in the book, I'll say something like, as I came to learn later, comma, blah, 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 whatever it is, you know what I mean? So that was a way of preserving I wanted to show how I learned, because most of us probably don't know the impacts on, whatever has happened in the land before. We do the land acknowledgement, but we might not know where those communities are now. It's a process of discovery for everybody. And for me, as a Canadian immigrant, my family, I think part of the story here is that my family had only just immigrated to Canada. We had only immigrated to Canada in 1973, and yet here we were in 1976 on Indigenous land with more rights, citizenship rights and financial, wealth and all of that than any Indigenous people. And so it's this weird aspect of the immigrant having more access to the resources of the nation state than the Indigenous. And the same is true here, although of course it's more, complicated in different ways. And so part of the story was we were not just a family that was up in the north working on the dam, we were an immigrant family up in the north working on the dam. And we weren't just an immigrant family up north working on the dam, we were a brown immigrant family up north working on the dam. So all of that comes into play, as you know, because you've read it, but all of that comes into play in the book, and that we ourselves felt displaced. That's why we ended up in North America in the first place, because we were displaced from the places that we came from, for various reasons. When people say refugee, you think you're fleeing with your house on your back or something like that. But there's plenty of people who leave for a livelihood. We say economic migrants or climate migrants. It's happening more and more in Bangladesh. The sea rise is going to necessitate. Almost 30 million people are going to be displaced in the next 30 years. That's climate change migration. It's not the political situation that's forcing people to flee their homes. It's the places actually become untenable to live. I mean, the entire state of Florida is going to have to be dealing with this too by 2050, whatever it is going to be. So get ready for the Floridians to come to Minneapolis, and if you're going to be looking for a handout. That's a joke, by the way. Just don't get it twisted. So yeah, that's why we put it in the present tense, because we wanted to show the narrator, who's me, obviously, learning about stuff. I didn't go up there knowing all of this. I very much discovered it as I was on the ground. Yeah. The Floridians are coming. Mark my words. Yeah, go ahead. Or whoever. I shouldn't be calling on people, because someone has the mic.
Yeah, I do.
Where are you?
Right here.
There you are. Hi.
Hi. So after your journey to Cross Lake in your book Northern Light, did you ever get the return and go in the lake or buy the crafts like you wanted to?
Yes, I did go back. I went back in fall of 2018. And then in the spring of 2019, I moved from Ohio to California. And so things got a little, it was a little busy, so I didn't get to go back in 2019. And then, of course, COVID. So my last visit was 2018. I do plan to go back, but I have not yet been back. But I have stayed in contact with most of the people that I talk about in the book. I've stayed in contact with. I talk with Jackson Osborne on the phone. We haven't talked in a while, actually. We haven't talked in about half a year, probably, but we used to talk almost every month. And Anna McKay, the principal of the school, and I have stayed in contact. I bought 40 or 50 copies of the book and sent it to the school, has them in their library, and they use them in their classes. And then I zoom in and talk to the classes. And the second time I went back, I actually taught at the school for them, for different like writing classes. And then I'm stay in touch with Kathy Merrick, who is no longer the chief. She didn't win her re-election. So there was a new chief, and there's been two chiefs since she was there. But I want to maintain those relationships. I think that's an important part of this story. I didn't want to just write the book and then be, one and done type of situation. So I would like to go back, and one of the things they've invited me to do was to go out on the lake. So, in fact, they want to do a video. They want to make a little documentary when I go back of me, like, going around and going on the lake and doing stuff. So we'll see about that, but maybe. Yeah.
Hi. So for my question, like as a writer and an author, what is like the overall meaning and or theme of the book Northern Light?
You're asking me that question?
Yeah.
That's my question for you. I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not kidding. What is it? What do you think? What do you think? You heard me read from it. You could say at least one thing.
Well, like my understanding of
Yeah,
it.
your understanding.
So for me, like I just feel like you're trying to find that feeling of belonging or finding that home. Like you talk about not feeling like it's home, even though like you grew up at Jinpeg, like not your whole life, but that place felt like more home. So like my understanding is like you're trying to find your true home and where you belong actually. Like that's.
There you go. Perfect.
Oh, all right.
A+.
Alrighty. Thank you.
Yeah. That wasn't so hard.
Hello.
Hi.
I'll preface this with I haven't read the book yet because I don't go here, but I remember in your talk you mentioned your friend telling you about the chronology of kind of the situation you were discovering and learning about again, and how you were just at the beginning, how little time had actually passed since settler colonization began on that territory. And I was wondering, like, from your perspective, like as an outsider and a kind of unique outsider being an immigrant to Canada, what was the process like of like stepping into the shoes of that chronology, and like how did it change you and like your perspective on the land and the people, if it has?
Yeah, thanks for coming, first of all, and thanks for your question. I had a lot of learning to do. I mean, a lot. When you read the book, if you read the book, there is a lot of background on history about, as I mentioned before, the treaty, the reservation system, public health issues. I talk about diet and nutrition, traditional agriculture, hunting, fishing, all of that stuff around the food chain. We would maybe more properly say like food web really, has been impacted by the dam, because it meant certain fish weren't coming, so then the bear weren't coming, then this animal, like it had repercussions. And I had to learn about water. So it's not just, we are often tempted to think about it in terms of the political history, and that it's true that has had the greatest impact in terms of whatever the military interventions were, or, the battles, or how the territory changed hands, but it's as equal to think about the botany, the zoology, the forestry, the water issues, like whether the lake is no longer drinkable water now because a lake water is potable when the silt stays at the bottom. If it's constantly being whipped up, then you can't drink the water anymore unless you treat it. So back in the day, you would just go and fill your cups from the lake and drink, and now there's extensive filtration before the water can be drunk. So when one thinks of the impacts of colonialism, it cannot be reduced to the timeline, the historical timeline of events. It has all of these various impacts, some of which are very studied and some of which are not very studied. So I'd say that was the most unusual thing that I did, was going into those. Like, I read reports on the sturgeon spawning patterns, and I read reports on the silt content of the water. I read the archaeological report. I read the original survey report of the river that initially surveyed the river to determine whether or not that it would be have an affinity for being developed as a hydroelectric site, all of that, So that's the kind of stuff that was sort of unexpected to me, that I also have no training for, I never took a single class in any of those things when I was in college myself. All of which is to tell you that, when we become reporters or journalists in that way, to kind of dig in and learn about the issue, it's like, you can do it. It's not like I'm not an expert in silt levels in lakes, and just because I read that one report, but I read that one report and I learned about it, and I understood it, as much of it as I could. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Hi.
Throughout the book, you talk about not belonging to any place. How has your experience growing up taught you what belonging to a home means? Or more specifically, at what point did you find your home or belonging?
Yeah, I don't know if I have. I mean, I've moved around so much, and I recognize that my experience is not the same as, I have friends who I went to high school with. My parents still live in the town where we all lived together. After we were in Manitoba, we went to New York City very briefly for 1 year, and then my parents settled in Western New York. I talked about that in the excerpt that I read to you. Well, they still live there. So it's 30-some years. We don't need to get into specifics, but since then. And when I go back to visit for, vacations and stuff like that, my high school friends, many of them are still there. And they've been there all along, and they've known each other all along. And they have 30 years of relationships and they know each other's children, and some of them have grandchildren. And that has not been my experience. So I do feel detached in a way that is more than metaphorical, I lived in Ohio for 10 and a half years. And that's the longest I've lived anywhere in my entire life, including with my parents. Because when we moved to Western New York, I lived there for 8 years, and then I went away to college, and I never moved back home. I always lived apart since then. So 10 and a half years in Oberlin is the longest I'd ever lived anywhere. And I lived in one single house in Oberlin for 9 years, and that was the longest I'd ever lived in like a house in my life. So I think for someone like me, it's just like, I don't know what it's like to be in. When I go back to my childhood home, it's not even the house I was raised in, because my parents sold that house and bought another house, and then they sold that one and bought another one. And so they now live in a house where it has a room that is like my room, but I never lived in it. So it's just an odd concept to me. I don't know what it means, and I don't know if it ever will. It might just mean that every place is home for me. I mean, I showed up in Minneapolis, and I was like, oh, let's go for a run. I went for a run along the river, and then Juliet came over and picked me up, and we went to the bar, and then we chatted up the bartender. Then I went and got a tattoo. Like, I live here, 1 day later. I probably did more living in the last day and a half than some of you did here in 3 months that you've been here. So I just adapt quickly. I think every place. I wrote a book called Bright Felon. They have it out on the table there. It's every chapter is a different city that I've lived in, and it's like 16 chapters. And that book ends in 2007. And then so there's like more cities after that. So I think I've just lived in a lot of places. I get somewhere, I unpack, I look around, and I say, like, who's here? What's going on? Who's gonna party? You know, like, and we just get to it. You know, there's no time. Yeah.
I have a
That's my
question about the intention of your writings. Would you say it's to educate, ignite change, or to simply tell a story?
Which writing? This book particular?
All of them.
I would say, I'm going to answer the back half first and say with this book, as I was writing it, I really came to understand that it had a mission and that its mission had less to do with me. I mean, my narrative in this book about my, not having a sense of home and wanting to discover where I belong, that's just a narrative hook. That's not the most important thing in the book, That's something that kind of makes the story hang together. That's what makes it an interesting story. But the truth, what I believe is the truth of the most important part about this book is the people in Cross Lake and what happened to them. That's why I wrote it, and that's what inspired me and kept me going. So there is that narrative tension in Northern Light between those two things, because I, as a character, loom very large in it, but I really did, in the revision, kind of dial that part back a little bit. In fact, I dialed it back so much that the second version of it was more of like a journalism. And it was the editor who then said, it should be more personal. You should include some of those things that you had there before about like wanting to know your family's place in Canada. Like that's part of the story. And so we kind of put that back in. With the rest of it, it is my form of expression, Like Diego Rivera, the Mexican muralist, famously said, I produce paintings the way a tree produces fruit. It's a biological function. And what he meant was he wasn't necessarily, and there's an irony behind it because, of course, his work was extremely political, much so if you know what he was doing and why he was doing it and what his political context was. He was super pro-labor. He was a communist at a time when that was, probably more meaningful thing to say, politically and in global politics. And so he had an extreme agenda, but he was saying as an artist, it was something that he kind of had to do. So that's kind of my way of talking, and it's my way of being in the world. It's my way of learning things about myself. And ultimately, it's a way of making a living too, because I make a living as a professor and a teacher of writing. So there's at least part of it is that, but that the real inspiration is much more personal and private, and does not have too much to do with the external world, with the exception, of course, as I mentioned, of this book, this last one. Yeah, thank you for your question. Are we wrapping up? Yeah, thank you so much. You guys have been really great.